Welcome to What Caused the Civil War? An online U.S. history tutorial for students in 11th grade. Click Next to get started. You probably know that the Civil War divided America like no other conflict in our nation's history. But do you know how it began, and more importantly, why? Americans still struggle to define this issue today. By the end of this tutorial, you should understand what the Civil War was and when and where it took place. You'll better understand the issues that led Americans to war and which ones were most central to causing the conflict. The Civil War, America's bloodiest conflict, raged for 4 long years, from 1861 to 1865. During that time, our nation was divided into two: the United States, or Union, seen here in blue, and the Confederate States, or Confederacy, seen here in red. A civil war is different from other wars because the people of a nation are fighting one another instead of a foreign enemy. You can hover over either of the boxes at the bottom of the screen for more information about the two sides. The Confederate States of America had several official flags, but this battle flag is by far the most widely recognized. Although it has 13 stars, only 11 states, the red ones you see here, actually formed the Confederacy. This flag remains a highly controversial symbol to this day. Some view it as a symbol of Southern pride, while to others it represents darker things from the American past, including slavery. We include the image in this tutorial because of its historical significance. This 35-star flag represents the Union during much of the Civil War, after West Virginia became a state in 1863. Nevada joined the Union in 1864, bringing the total number of states to 36. This number includes the southern states in rebellion, because the U.S. government never officially recognized the Confederacy as its own nation. The light blue states on this map represent southern states that allowed slavery but remained loyal to the Union. The Confederates. People often talk about the Civil War in terms of North versus South, but that isn't entirely accurate. Not all the states considered Southern joined the Confederacy. Several remained loyal to the United States. For this reason, we'll describe the war in terms of the Union versus the Confederacy. Let's compare the two sides so you know the basics. 25 states made up the Union during the war years. These states had a population of about 21 million people at the time. Abraham Lincoln led the Union through the entire war as president and commander-in-chief. Many generals led the Union war effort, but the best known, and the one who brought the war to a successful conclusion, was Ulysses S. Grant. 11 states made up the Confederacy. These states had a far smaller population of about 9 million, but more than a third of those people were African American slaves. The Confederacy elected its own president, Jefferson Davis. Its most famous and successful general was Robert E. Lee. Let's review to see if you got all that. From these answer choices, select all the true statements that correctly describe the American Civil War. Click Submit when you found them all. Correct. Lincoln was president during the Civil War, while Robert E. Lee was the top general for the Confederacy, and the Union had a much bigger population, as you learned. But those dates were off by a century. The war lasted from 1861 to 1865. You also remembered that in a civil war, citizens of a nation fight each other, not against a foreign enemy. It's time to make a prediction based on what you know or think you know. What caused the Civil War? This is a complicated question, so answer it in the best way you can. Then click Submit. like you. We'll spend the rest of this tutorial attempting to answer this complicated question. At the end, you'll have a chance to revisit your answer. The United States, which began its nationhood in 1776 after declaring independence from Great Britain, enjoyed tremendous success in its first century. The territory, population, and wealth of the new nation expanded beyond the dreams of its founding fathers. But the northern and southern parts of the new country had significant differences in their cultures, economies, and populations. Over time, Northerners and Southerners became alienated from one another, almost coming to feel like they lived in two different nations. North and South historically disagreed over political issues like taxes, tariffs on trades, and the funding of national improvements like roads, bridges, and railroads. States' rights was another issue on which the North and South disagreed. Generally, Northerners were more comfortable with a stronger, more active federal government, while Southerners preferred to keep power in the governments of their states. There were exceptions to this, though. One central issue, however, came to dominate American politics, especially in the years leading up to the Civil War. That issue was slavery. Slavery had originally been legal in the entire United States, although it had always been rarer in the North. But by the 1800s, the practice was legal only in the southern states. Northern states had banned it by law. Cotton was a southern crop, and the cotton boom of the early 19th century made slave labor more valuable than ever to the South's economy. To illustrate this point, understand that by 1860, the 4 million black Americans enslaved in the South represented the most valuable possessions owned by anyone in the United States. Their dollar value was worth more than all the factories and railroads in the North combined. Not only was slavery big business, but it became a fundamental part of the identity and social order of the South. Many Southerners came to view slavery as their peculiar institution, the unique feature of their culture that made it superior, they believed, to that of the North. Because of this, Southern politicians became determined to expand slavery to the new Western territories that had become part of the U.S. in the 1840s. Hover over the image for more information. This engraving depicts slaves working at a cotton gin, an invention of the early 1800s that made cotton, and slavery, invaluable to the South. Before the cotton gin, slavery had not been very profitable, leading some to hope that it would die a natural death. After the resulting cotton boom, however, American slavery became big business. You should have picked thumbs down. Remember that all the United States, including northern states like New York and Massachusetts, allowed slavery in the early years of this country. By the 1800s, however, the North had banned slavery while it still thrived in the South. This eventually led to a great division between the two regions. Slaves in America led generally wretched lives and had no control of their fate or that of their families. They could be bought and sold for any reason, and family members could be separated at any time. Slaves worked under constant threat of violence, and they were kept ignorant and illiterate, unable to read or write, by law. Some slaves managed to escape or rebel, but successful attempts to do so were rare. In the North, a growing number of people known as abolitionists wanted to see an immediate end to slavery. In the 1850s, a new political party, the Republicans, formed in the North. Their party platform called for an end to slavery's expansion, but not slavery itself. They wanted no new slave states created from the Western territories. In the South, many viewed the rise of the Republican Party as an attack on their way of life. "Am I not a man and a brother?" asks the shackled slave in this famous image. The drawing by Josiah Wedgwood was originally created as the seal of a British anti-slavery organization, but it was used widely in the U.S. by American abolitionists who wanted to see slavery end. Between 1850 and 1860, a series of events centered around the slavery controversy brought North and South to the brink of war. Move Uncle Sam along the timeline at the bottom of the screen to see and hear more about each event. Be sure not to skip any. 1850. A federal Fugitive Slave Act was part of the Compromise of 1850 to balance out California entering the Union as a free state. This law made it easier for Southerners to recapture escaped slaves who were living in the North, and made it illegal for Northerners to help them. The law became extremely unpopular in the North. 1852. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a best-selling novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It was an emotional story with a strong anti-slavery message, and it changed the hearts and minds of Northerners who read it. Many readers finished the book believing as never before that slavery was an evil practice. 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned an old law known as the Missouri Compromise, which had kept slavery out of much of the West. The new law allowed slavery in the new states to be created from the Western territories. This angered Northerners like Abraham Lincoln, an ex-congressman who re-entered politics as a result of this act's passage. 1856. Charles Sumner was an outspoken anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts. On the floor of the U.S. Senate, Sumner was savagely beaten with a cane by Preston Brooks, a Southern congressman who felt Brooks had insulted him and his family. In the South, Brooks was hailed by many as a hero, but in the North he was perceived as a villain. 1857. Dred Scott was a Missouri slave who sued for his freedom because he had spent years living in the North. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled against Scott. Not only was he a slave, said the court, but black Americans like Scott lacked the basic rights of citizens, including the right to sue in court. 1859. John Brown was a radical abolitionist determined to end slavery by any means necessary. He led a violent raid on the federal weapons arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to arm freed slaves and start a race war. Brown's plot failed, and he was executed. But before his death, he left this grim warning for the future. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. 1860. In 1860, Lincoln was elected as the first Republican president of the United States. Lincoln had promised not to interfere with slavery where it already was, but because of his party's position, Southerners feared it was the beginning of the end. States like South Carolina now threatened secession from the Union.